Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
It's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio. And in the second half of this episode, we'll talk about the interview you've done with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby.
Yes, we will. But first of all, let's talk to our esteemed colleague, Mark Lowen, who newscasters will know from his excellent reporting around Europe and all over the place, but particularly perhaps from a lot of the very good reporting he did over a period of years from Turkey. Massive country, maybe not talked about enough in UK politics and news and current affairs, but a very, very interesting place, particularly at the moment, with lots and lots of political turmoil going on. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Lovely to talk to you.
First, I wonder, can we go to the heart of the protests today, which are still ongoing? And can you tell us, remind us, why this is such a critical time in the political process?
First of all, Turkey is a really critical country, remember. It's the second biggest NATO military. It's got the second biggest NATO army. It's the eastern flank of NATO. It is a really important country when it comes to everything from Ukraine to Syria to migration. It's a huge country. And so that partly the spotlight is on Turkey just simply because of the nature of the country. And then President Erdogan is a hugely influential world figure. He's been in power for 22 years. And the state of Turkish democracy has eroded quite considerably under particularly the last decade or so of his rule. And about 10 days ago, his biggest political rival, the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu, was detained because the authorities said he was accused of bribery and corruption. And 4 days later, he was formally arrested and held in pre-trial detention. Now, that all happened, his detention happened 4 days before he was supposed to be chosen as the main opposition party's candidate to fight President Erdogan in an election. So his supporters and the majority of the country, according to opinion polls, think that he was arrested for in a politically motivated move.
Stitched up.
And it sparked massive protests, the biggest street protests in Turkey in over a decade. And the protests have grown beyond his cause, if you like, into a kind of rallying cry for democracy in Turkey and against the growing authoritarianism of President Erdogan.
And today, in fact, there are still hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in Turkey protesting. The BBC team on the ground there today says tens of thousands of protesters are spilling into a neighbouring park from where the original demo was taking place on the Asian side of Istanbul to demand the mayor's release from prison, as well as early elections. So clearly this is a very restless moment in that country, and you've explained why it's so important for all sorts of reasons. But Mark, what happened to you? I mean, how did you get caught up in this? And why are you speaking to us from a fairly neutral room, shall we say, rather than from the streets in Turkey?
Yeah, or indeed from police custody, because what happened to me was that I used to be the BBC Turkey correspondent for 5 years between 2014 and 2019, and I went back to Istanbul last Sunday to cover these protests, and it felt like coming home. It was, I love the country. I've got a lot of affection for it, and I speak the language to a kind of reasonable degree. And I'd been there for a couple of days reporting out on the streets, and then on Wednesday I was in my hotel room, and the phone in the room rang, and the receptionist said, Mr. Lowen, we've got something really important to discuss with you in person. Could you please come down? And I said, can I just talk to you on the phone about it? And they said, no, can you please come down? So I went downstairs and was met by three plainclothes policemen who escorted me off the hotel, tried to stop my cameraman from filming on his phone, and took me into a police car and whisked me away to the Istanbul police headquarters, which incidentally was where the mayor of Istanbul had been taken for his detention a few days earlier. And they kept me there initially for 7 hours, and I was held. I was allowed to have two of my colleagues present who could use their phones. I couldn't. And actually, the atmosphere there initially, Laura, was quite cordial, and a few of them were saying, we don't agree with this, and it's the state that is doing this.
Really? police officers were saying that to you?
Yeah, one policeman at the end hugged me and said, "You're a good man, and we want you to be free." And then after 7 hours, my two colleagues were sent away, and I was taken to a second location, which was the Foreigners Custody Department of the Istanbul police, and kept there for 5 hours. And the atmosphere was hardening. I was fingerprinted, wasn't allowed any contact with lawyers or phone or anything. And after another 5 hours, so at 2:30 in the morning, they presented me with a paper saying I was going to be deported because I was, quote, a threat to public order. When I asked them for what they meant about that, they said it was a decision by the government and they couldn't elaborate. And then I said, would I be allowed back into Turkey? And one policeman, this was all in my slightly broken Turkish, said, I tell you what, I've got an idea. Why don't I film you saying that you're leaving willingly and of your own accord, and then I can show that to my bosses and we can publish it and it'll all be fine and you can come back. And I said, no, thanks very much, because I knew that would be given directly to the pro-government media. 90% of the media in Turkey is under the control or supportive of the president. And then at 2:30, I was moved to the final location, which was the custody unit at Istanbul airport, and held there for another 5 hours, so 17 hours in total, and then put on an 8 a.m. flight, deported to London.
Yeah, and the truth is that you're not the only journalist to be arrested. You're close to us, you're a colleague of ours, but I believe 11 journalists have been arrested recently. They lock up protesters, they lock up politicians they don't like. And is it also the case that in this sort of Putin rule book, our NATO ally, Erdogan, wants to change the constitution?
He wants to stay in power, Paddy, and at the moment, the constitution limits him to 2 terms in office, so he would have to finish in 2028. But he clearly wants to stay in power beyond that, and so he has 2 options open to him. One is to change the constitution to allow him a 3rd term, but he would need a 2/3 majority of MPs in Parliament, and he doesn't have those numbers. And the other option open to him is a snap early election, which would mean that he wouldn't have seen out his full 2nd term, so he could then stay in office longer. And that is where the detention and arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul, comes in, because polls show that were the 2 men to face off in an election, Imamoglu would win. So the strong suspicion is that Erdogan is scared of the mayor of Istanbul and therefore has put him in jail ahead of potentially calling any early election. Turkish government completely denies that. And funnily enough, as I was in the air being deported back to the UK, the Turkish Justice Minister was holding a press conference with international press in Istanbul, insisting that Turkey is a state of law and journalists are completely free to report. Little did he know, because the BBC had not yet made public, that I had just been detained and deported for no reason. I have to say that I was not mistreated in detention, even though there was a slightly aggressive atmosphere at times. There was no mistreatment. And hours after I arrived back in London, the Turkish government press office rushed to put out a statement saying that I had been detained because I lacked the necessary accreditation. But at no point was that mentioned during my detention, and it very much seemed to be an afterthought, a kind of rushed attempt to justify what they had done.
And Mark, I suppose, what's the potential way out of this? So we know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who've been going onto the streets in Turkey. You've just shared with us that if polls are to be believed, then the man who's been locked up, the mayor of Istanbul, would likely beat Erdogan if there were to be an election and he was free to fight it. But in Erdogan's camp, among his supporters, is there any suggestion or any hint that his time might be up? Or is his base, such as it is, very solid?
He's got a still significant support base, which tends to be more religious, more conservative Turks. I remember when I used to go to his rallies, and there was, among his real loyalists, there's a depth of fanaticism that is quite extraordinary. I remember one woman once saying to me, if I can breathe freely in this country, it's thanks to him, because the religious conservative side of the country that were not allowed to wear headscarves in public institutions, for example, until Erdogan came into power. They feel completely emboldened by him. It is a clientelistic state, in effect, where it's not just Erdogan, it is Erdoganism. It's an entire system where people in politics, business, media, religious institutions, they all depend on him. So it is a system of governance, really. But that support base has dwindled over the years, particularly as the economy has really collapsed to some extent. I mean, when I moved to Turkey in 2014, there were 3 Turkish lira to the pound. It's now 40 to the pound. Inflation has completely just absolutely soared. So that, combined with the progressive clampdown on democracy, freedom of speech, civil society, the jailing of hundreds of thousands of people has eroded trust in him. But the question is whether Imamoglu would be kept in jail, so the opposition would be hobbled, whether they would boycott any election. And remember, Laura, Erdogan is also emboldened by the current international climate. You've got Donald Trump in the White House, who called for his own political rival to be locked up and shows little concern about autocracy rising elsewhere in the world. And Turkey, perhaps more important than ever, is a key player in Ukraine, in Syria, on migration. And so criticism of him internationally has been muted. The question now is whether the opposition can maintain and sustain the momentum of these protests, and whether perhaps he has, Turkey's great political survivor and master tactician may have just underestimated the depth of opposition in the country. But it's just too early to tell. And
the love for Turkey that you have allows me to ask, in closing, sort of 2 things together. It's true, isn't it, that this tug of war between the state and the public is an eternal one in Turkey. It goes back to the founding of the modern state. And it's also true that this detention has not shaken your affection for the Turkish people.
Yeah, that's very true, Paddy. And I have to say that the morning before my detention, I was walking around my old neighbourhood where I used to live, and I saw the guy who used to be the doorman in my building, used to come and clean the building. And I saw my old hairdresser, and I went up and hugged them, and I was chatting to them, and I actually messaged my family and said, I love this place so much. I really feel like I'm back home. And then the screenshot of the WhatsApp message was, so that was the message at just before 2:00 p.m. local time. And then at 2:30, my next message is, I'm being detained. And, for me, it was a very kind of visceral sign of kind of the extreme. It's a very sort of extreme place in many ways. It swings between kind of, it's either wonderful or kind of very tough. And I mean, I remember a Turk saying to me before I moved there, we're very radical people. We're either radically secular or radically religious or radically militaristic, or, and so Turks are the ones who are kind of, dancing on tables at the end of bars because they do everything to extreme. And yes, I love the place, and I would hate not to be able to return, not to be able to take my little 2-year-old daughter there and show her my old home. That will be a question for another day. I sort of want the dust to settle, and then I will explore what options are available. But it is a very fascinating, beautiful, maddening country, and it's facing a potentially pivotal moment in its democratic history, and I hope to be able to go back to enjoy it and report on it.
And we do still have teams there. So you had this dreadful experience, but we've got BBC teams reporting there on the ground. Until this point, when it all went terribly wrong, what has it been like to report there? I mean, what was it like when you were back this time? How do you operate as a journalist? Because I know I don't ask it to be self-indulgent, but newscasters, we know, sometimes are interested in these things.
We do risk assessments. We have tear gas masks, because at the end of every protest, the police disperse the entirely peaceful protest with tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray. We make sure that we kind of discuss our deployment. For those first 2 days of my deployment, it was totally fine. I mean, I was, speaking to protesters. I mean, I have to say, I remember that most of the protesters covered their face. And I said to one of them we were interviewing them, and I said, why are you covering your face? And he said to me, because the police come to our houses at 6:00 in the morning without any warning, if they see us on camera, and they detain us. And then, 12 hours later, it was happening to me. So, the protesters feel very, very under threat at the moment. But they're defiant and they're standing firm. And many of them said to me, we're not going to leave these streets until Imamoglu is out of jail and Erdogan is out of power.
Mark, thanks so much for speaking to us, and I'm glad that you got out safely. Sorry that it happened to you, but thank you for recounting the experience to us and explaining why it's so important what happens in Turkey. I think it is a country we don't talk about that much in our sort of domestic news. It's not subject of, even there's a big Turkish community here in the UK, it's not a subject or a place in the world that we talk about.
No, when you think about how much we talk about the United States of America, there's hardly any room left in the oxygen in the room. Mark, do come and join us again. Thank you very much.
Lovely to chat to you both.
Thank you.
See you.
And now we move on to your interview with the former Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1,000 years, no one ever resigned. And Justin Welby did, because he was at the middle of a what did he know and when did he know it scandal.
And we talked a lot at the time on Newscast about what happened here. And most people will remember there was a horrific period in the Church of England when around 100 young men and boys were abused by a barrister called John Smyth, who ran Christian camps where boys would go off for the summer. And the first allegations of those were reported in the 1980s. But then nothing ever came out into the public domain at that point. Then in 2013, who was new in the job then, Archbishop of Canterbury, was told about an allegation that the police had got involved in, that this kind of abuse had been going on by John Smyth, who Justin Welby knew.
Because he'd been at the same camp.
He'd been at the same camp. He's always said he's not somebody who was sort of particularly close to, or he didn't know him that well, but he was somebody in his knowledge. And when an official report was published in November last year, it was highly critical of the church and Welby personally for basically not doing anything about that allegation. Just saying, OK, well, the police is looking at it, move on. The careful phrase was that Justin Welby wasn't sufficiently curious about what had happened. And after days of public pressure, and including Downing Street publicly not giving him support, Justin Welby, as you said, became the first Archbishop of Canterbury to quit during a scandal, to resign because of mistakes that he had made. And since he left in November, he hasn't spoken about what happened, apart from a disastrous speech in the House of Lords. So we sat down with him this week to talk about what went wrong, what went terribly wrong. And also, as people will hear, he's a figure in modern history, to hear tomorrow also what are his reflections, having been in that job for more than a decade. But we started today sharing some of the conversation about what went wrong, why he didn't take action in 2013 when he was told about this allegation of how John Smyth had been behaving.
Every day, more cases were coming across the desk that had been in the past, hadn't been dealt with adequately. And this was it was another case. And yes, I knew Smyth, but you can't. It was an absolutely overwhelming few weeks. Now, that's not an excuse. It's a reason, it's not an excuse.
But the police had been called
and
over allegations of abuse being carried out by someone you knew.
Exactly.
You'd been warned years before in a different context that he wasn't a nice man.
It was overwhelming. One was trying to prioritise. But I think it's easy to sound defensive over this. The reality is I got it wrong. I did not do, as Archbishop, there are no excuses. Being overwhelmed is a reason, it isn't an excuse.
The abuse meted out by John Smyth was horrific. The boys were beaten till they bled, and they were told this was part of their religious instruction. And many of them have been brave enough to come forward. And I know from the work you've done in this field before, we should probably say at this point, we need to think about the victims of John Smyth. I know you've spoken to some, and in my career, so have I. So we've just refocused this conversation. They lived with a lifetime of abuse, and they also lived knowing that the authorities did not do anything.
And for a victim of Smyth who we spoke to today, he told me today that the way that the church has handled this is worse than the abuse that was meted out to him.
Is that what he said? Is that the way he sees it?
Yes.
Because it's like, here's the thing that happened, and here's the fact that you did nothing about it for 20 years.
Yes, and didn't listen, and didn't meet us, and didn't take it seriously. And when victims, and some would choose to call themselves survivors, this victim I'm talking about does call himself a victim. He's known as Graham. He was the man who was the first, who made that first allegation in 2013. And he told me today that it was worse what the church, how they had handled it or not handled it. And he feels shunned him, refused to have meetings. He feels that is worse than what actually happened to him at the hands of the abuser. And in terms of this new Welby explanation, which he doesn't say is an excuse, as we heard, but this new Welby explanation that he was overwhelmed by all of the abuse cases, and that's basically why he didn't do anything about this one. Graham, which is not his real name, but it's how he is known because we are preserving his anonymity, he said, sorry, let me just get this. You want to?
I just want to say, and while we're looking for the further quote from Graham, it's worth saying, isn't it, that Justin Welby has spoken to victims, survivors, maybe not all of them, but he has.
He has, but it took several years for him to do that. And there's frustration among that group of people that they don't feel that he heard. Having a meeting is one thing. Taking ages to have a meeting is another. Not really listening, not really understanding is quite another thing. And this is what Graham said to me today. If it wasn't a priority, then what was? You may have been swamped by other cases, but if this one wasn't fairly close to the top of the pile, then what was? He had a direct contact into the camps, his own knowledge of John Smyth, whether or not he was overwhelmed, this was a priority.
And also we know that when he left the country, and he did so in part because the net was closing in on him, albeit much too late and much too slowly, he moved to South Africa, where it looks very likely that the abuse continued. So the fact that our Church of England did not act by moving this into a police as much as it could towards the police meant that it looks that this man was able to abuse in South Africa. Now, one of our sort of counterpart colleagues, a journalist, Cathy Newman at Channel 4 News, tracked John Smyth down in South Africa. It's an amazing piece of reporting for newscasters who want more information. But of course, in your case, getting Justin Welby to talk about this, did you feel that he is trying to move forward? Did he need to correct the record or to address the record? Because the last attempt he made was absolutely appalling, wasn't it, in the House of Lords when he appeared to be joking?
I think, why did he choose to say yes to doing an interview? I think that there's a sense that there was a frenzy around his resignation, and there was a frenzy around the Makin report, which was the official verdict on what happened, which we should say also finds it hard to believe, that report, that Welby didn't know before 2013. He says he didn't know anything about it. He's absolutely adamant about that, but Makin takes a different view. I think that after a period of months, after a period of sort of a frenzy, that Justin Welby concluded it was worth him giving his version of events. He clearly did want to make it clear that he is very, very sorry for the things that he got wrong. There's also an awful lot of things that happened during his time as Archbishop of Canterbury that were not relating to this appalling scandal, and some of that we discussed too. You know, he presided over the coronation and Her Late Majesty's funeral, and of course are vexed issues for the church about the fact that right now, if you're gay or a female, you don't have equal rights in the Church of England, and the changes that Justin Welby tried to make and didn't manage to get his own way on all of those things. But without question, the most urgent issue was to address what he really knew about John Smyth, why he didn't act. And the why is, I think, still really quite baffling. You know, he said, OK, well, the police said I couldn't interfere in the case. Well, that's not the same as saying you mustn't go off and find out if there are any other victims. He then said, well, I was overwhelmed. There were so many abuse cases. This was just another case, even though I knew Smyth. I don't think that's going to satisfy any of the victims. And again, newscasters might think, if you know the problem is so big, ought that not to make you even more concerned to really grip it and make change and get on with it? So I think the why is still quite baffling. And I wonder, you know, we spent quite a long time in conversation earlier this week, and I wonder actually if he has really resolved the question of why he didn't act. I'm not sure. And for many victims, of course, and maybe, you know, skeptics around there say, well, actually, he suggests it looks like he didn't take action because he didn't take it seriously enough.
We go back to the business at hand, which is that this is at its heart a sexual abuse scandal.
And we should say there's lots of help on the BBC Action Line website. If this is something that has affected you, it's not so long since we talked about what had happened to Charles Spencer, Lady Diana's brother. Do you remember we did an interview that's not so long ago, and we were very, very moved, I think, but also contacted by a lot of people who had had that kind of thing happen in their life. So there is help out there. Please do get in touch with us, or the BBC Action Line has got organisations out there who can provide support.
For now, we'll leave this Saturday edition, but thanks to you very much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.
We'll see you then.
See you then. Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.